To start with, I'll say a few things and then we'll have
Sikyong, if you don't mind. Thank you again for joining us this morning. For those who don't know me, I'm Pinji Wangel, kind of facilitating this discussion here. I know that English is a preferred medium of communication for you guys, so Sikyong and I will try to keep it in English. I am by no definition qualified to be a youth, but because I was the first youth here in Chicago back in 1992, and I have seen our community evolve as a youth myself in high school in 92 to now being a parent sending my daughter to Sunday school. So I hope I can lend my perspective for you all to feel comfortable to ask Sikyong any questions that's burning on your mind, top of mind. You know, this is a safe environment for you, no judgment. English is fine. So with that said, it's my great honor and privilege to welcome Sikyong Penpa here today for this event. I'm going to not take too much of your time, so I'll turn over to Tenzin Putsala at High School at New Trier to give a brief introduction for Sikyong so people here have some background about his qualification, and then Sikyong, if you can please share your remarks. Thank you.
We're so excited to get this opportunity to speak. I'm Usama, and we are here on behalf of the Tibetan Youth Council at the Tibetan Alliance of Chicago. Today I have a brief introduction on Sikyong. So, Sikyong Penpa was born in Pelakopi refugee camp in Karnataka in 1967. He attended the Central School for Tibetans in Pelakopi, topped the merit class list in class 12. He did his graduation from Madras Christian College in Chennai, where he majored in economics. During college, Sikyong served as the General Secretary of the Tibetan Freedom Movement and the Nigerian Tibet Friendship Association. He later worked as Executive Director at the Tibetan Parliamentary and Research Center in Delhi from 2001 to 2008. Sikyong was elected to the Parliament of Central Tibetan Administration, CTA, for 2 terms, from 1996 to 2006. Following this, he became the Speaker of the 14th and 15th Parliament between 2008 to 2016. He also served as a North America representative of Dalai Lama, researched to Office of Tibet, Washington, D.C., before running for Sikyong position in 2020. He was sworn in as Sikyong on May 27, 2021. Again, thank you for this opportunity. We're all grateful and hope to have a fruitful and enlightening conversation today.
Thank you. First, thank you for this word.
I can't name the person.
It's okay.
Little girl.
Yeah, looks like. So anyway, thank you for this opportunity. We try to make it a point to meet with the younger generation of Tibetans, because I believe that the generation that came from Tibet and who worked for us for the last 50, 60 years, they did their job well, and that is the reason why we are here today, well established. Well, now it is the generation, the first generation that were born in India or Nepal or Bhutan or elsewhere, who's taking over the responsibility of the Central Tibetan administration now. And it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the younger generations of Tibetans are informed about what's happening in Tibet, and develop organic leadership among the youth so that you will be in future responsible to take leadership of the Tibetan cause. So to take up leadership, you have to know what's happening inside Tibet. You have to know what Tibet was, or you have to know what we are aiming for into the future, right? So first I'll give you a very brief description of how we describe Tibet and how others perceive Tibet. So in our prayers, in your weekend class also, you must be reciting this prayer, Khangri Rave Kowe Shingham Jong. So Khangri Rawa, Khangri is mountain, Rawa is ranges. So it's like fence. Rawa is actually fence. So it's a mountain surrounded by mountain ranges. And Shingham is more like heavenly abode. So it's like the heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. That is our description of our land. Then I read one book written in 1906 by an American who lived in the eastern part of Amdo, bordering China. And he wrote this book called The Frontier Outpost. If you can note down those names, that will help you to look for that book. Right? And then eventually read and then understand a little more about what people have written about us. So this person, I don't remember his name now, but the book's name is The Frontier Outpost. And in that book, one of the chapters was titled as The Roof of the World. So maybe Westerners started referring to Tibet as roof of the world earlier than that, but that was what I saw in a book. So the rest of the world, the rest of the Western world, referred to Tibet as the roof of the world. Again, why? Why roof of the world? When I was in Japan, I was speaking to students there, and I was telling them, which is the highest mountain in Japan? Any ideas? Japan, Fuji. Now Fuji is about 3,700 meters above sea level, which is equal to about 12,000 feet above sea level. So I was telling the Japanese, Mount Fuji, which is the highest in your country, is like a base camp in Tibet. Well, because the average altitude of Tibet is about 12,000 feet above sea level. Now the Asians refer to Tibet as the fountain of Asian rivers or source of Asian water. The reason being, because of the high plateau of Tibet, rivers that originate from Tibet goes into India, Pakistan in the form of Indus River. Rivers that flow into India, like the Ganges, which originate from the border of Tibet and India, that comes into India. Then you also have Brahmaputra, which flows into India and into Bangladesh. And there are smaller rivers that flows into Nepal. Then there is the Irrawaddy River, which flows into Burma. Then there is the Mekong, which flows into Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. 5 countries. 5 plus India, 6, Nepal, 7, Pakistan, 8, and China. So 2 major rivers of China, which feeds the northern part and southern part, are the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So these 2 major rivers also originate from Tibet. And Yellow River is actually referred to as the Kashmir. That is where the Chinese civilization was established. Tibet is referred to as the fountain of Asian rivers or water tower of Asia. Now the environmental scientists refer to Tibet as the third pole. So the 2 other poles are North Pole and South Pole. Why Tibet is the third pole? Because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers. That is why Tibet is being referred to as the third pole. So this being the geographic description of Tibet, there is also a lot of the geopolitical and geostrategic importance of Tibet. So on the east of Tibet traditionally was China. On the north was Mongolia and East Turkestan. On the south you have India, Nepal, Bhutan, and also including Burma. And in the west you have Pakistan and Afghanistan. So it's centrally located, surrounded by so many different countries. That is why it is geostrategically and geopolitically very important for the whole region. So when Tibet was independent, it was a buffer state between the 2 most populous nations in the world, China and India. And there was never ever a war between China and India because they didn't share a common border. right? Tibet was in between. After communist Chinese invaded Tibet, then only it became India's China border. So even now, if you go to India on the border areas, you will find ITBP or ITBF, which means Indo-Tibetan Border Police and Indo-Tibetan Border Force. The Indian government has still not changed that name of the police and the force. So which means India's position is still reserved there, area. Then the ecological importance, environmental importance of Tibet, I already mentioned. Some people say that out of the 8 billion people in this world, about 1.8 billion people have something or the other to do with rivers that originate from Tibet. So they are dependent on Tibet. That is why sometimes I say, even though we are political refugees today, in the days to come there will be so many environmental refugees. Because these are some of the most densely populated areas in the world, the countries that I mentioned. So you're talking about water security in future, because China does not share any hydrological data with any of its neighboring countries. So nobody knows what's happening inside Tibet on water situation. For example, China is building one mega dam on where the Brahmaputra flows from western Tibet to eastern Tibet and then takes a U-turn to southern Tibet and then comes into India. At that U-turn, they are building a dam twice the size of Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world. And this new dam is supposed to produce 3 times the electricity, hydroelectricity, that the Three Gorges Dam produces right now. So in that sense, you can imagine how much water is needed for that dam on the Tsangpo, and then how much land will be submerged because of that dam, which will eventually affect the flora and fauna of that region, which is very unique to Tibet. And the whole Himalayan region is a seismic zone, because the Indian part was a totally different area. The Asian plate and the Gondwana plate came together and then it formed the Himalayas. People still claim that Himalaya is still growing because of the traction within the seismic movement underground. So since it's a seismic zone, if something happens to the size of that kind of a dam, what will happen to people who live downstreams in India, in Arunachal Pradesh, in the state of Assam, in Bangladesh? They'll all be washed away. So it's going to be very consequential if there are natural disasters on those places. And China has built so many dams on the Mekong alone, which originates from Tibet. Before it goes into the next country, there are at least 32 dams just on one river. Then there are so many other dams. Now the Yellow River is the cradle of Chinese civilization, and it caters water to whole of North China. And the Yangtze River, which flows through Kham into China, provides water for all of South China. So if Chinese government does not give importance to Tibet's environment and its fragility and causes irreversible damages to Tibet's environment, it's going to affect their own country as well. Last year, about 6-7 months ago, the height of the level of Yangtze went down by about 50%. So that affected navigation, that affected hydroelectricity generation. So these impacts the Chinese themselves can see. Way back in 1998, there was a huge flood on the Yangtze, which destroyed so many properties and killed many people. And because of that, China started giving a little more importance to Tibet's environment, but it's still not enough. International environmental experts are not allowed to go into Tibet to study on their own. I know of 1 or 2 universities in Germany who has been working with Chinese scientists inside Tibet, but they are not allowed to go to other places apart from the places fixed for their study. So they cannot do any social impact of environmental destruction inside Tibet, except for the climate change issues. Now, the climate change that is occurring in different parts of the world is very fast, but the climate change on Tibet is at least twice the speed of climate change that's happening in other parts of the world. So you can imagine the consequences of environmental damages on Tibet, which will not only be of concern to the Tibetans, but the whole region. Then we are also talking about food security. If there's not enough water in the downstream countries, then they're going to have serious food problems. So water security, food security, all these are going to be major issues. Some people claim that the Third World War could happen because of water. These are just brief description about Tibet. And Tibet's population since 1959 till about last year, we have always been saying 6 million, 6 million, 6 million. So this time we asked Tibet Policy Institute to look into the 2020 survey of the Chinese government, and now it seems the Tibetan population has gone up to 7 million. This is the geography, people, and the flora and fauna in Tibet is also very unique to the Tibetan plateau. So that is also very important. So that part. Then I will cover a little bit about the history of Tibet. Before 7th century, there is not much of historical record, apart from what we talk about from Nyadisembo onwards, up to the 7th century. But between 7th century, there is a lineage of kings up to the 7th century. We have a recorded history of more than 2,200 years, Tibetan history. From 7th century to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. We even conquered the capital of China at that time called Xi'an, Xian, Xi'an of those days. We dethroned the king, put a puppet king in his place. We even went west up to Samarkand, of present-day Uzbekistan. So that was the extent of Tibet's empire between 7th to 9th century. Then 7th century was also the period when Buddhism came into Tibet in the form of Buddha Shakyamuni's statue, one brought by Songtsen Gampo's princess wife, consort from China, and one brought, that was Wenchen Kunchu, and the other princess from Nepal. Now Chinese government claims that Tibet became part of China since Tibetan emperor took a Chinese princess as his wife. Now they are not able to explain that. So at that time, Tibet was a big empire, and Tibetan emperor was powerful, so he could seek neighboring countries' daughters' hand for his, and he had a Nepalese princess also as his wife. So if China can claim their legitimacy over Tibet by sending their princess in marriage to a Tibetan king, then Nepal can also claim the same thing, no? Because Nepal also sent a princess in marriage to Songtsen Gampo. So that cannot be justified. That's a hollow argument. So these are some of the things that you will have to argue back to the Chinese students if they talk about all this. Then 7th century, it was just introduction of the Buddha statues in Tibet, not the real teachings. In 8th century, then Shantarakshita, Indian Buddhist monk, came to Tibet. And then he found that there are too many challenges, and then Guru Rinpoche, Guru Padmasambhava was invited to Tibet. So these are all mystical things where he controlled all the demons and turned them into protecting deities and all that. But that was the beginning of the real introduction of Buddhism in Tibet. But Buddhism had spread to China much before it came to Tibet. So Buddhism went to China about 3rd century. So Chinese Buddhist influence was already there in Tibet. There were some Chinese Buddhist monks, and then Indian Buddhist monks were also there. So what the Tibetan emperor Tizon Dezhen did was he organized a debate between the Indian masters and the Chinese masters. and the Indian master won. So the Chinese were pushed back to China, and since that time we adopted the Nalanda school of the Buddhism in Tibet. Now, since the advent of Buddhism into Tibet, then the whole Tibetan way of life also started changing. In 8th century, these are remarkable things which we should know and explain to others also. We must have been one country who organized a medical conference for 2 years. Those days, in 8th century. These days you can travel from India to here in 15, 17 hours. But those days to travel into Tibet itself takes that much time. That to go out of Tibet itself takes so many months. And then to have the conference itself, they had for two years. And in 8th century, around the same period, what Shantarakshita advised the Tibetan emperor was that instead of me teaching you Buddhism in Sanskrit, you already have a language. So why don't you translate all the Buddhist texts into Tibetan? And that is exactly what Tsering and his team did. So we transliterated all available Sanskrit texts into Tibetan language. So that is why we have become a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom, which His Holiness is very proud of quoting again and again, right? Because Buddhism is based on logic. And the Nalanda tradition particularly talks about questioning Buddha's logic also. That is very different from other religions. You cannot question your source of your religion. If you say that this is blasphemy and all that. But we as Buddhists, we can always question Buddha's wisdom also. If you believe that you have a better logic than Buddha, you can always do that. So that is why Buddhism is so adjustable. That is why Buddhism is also goes very well with science. So we must have had the biggest transliteration house in the world at that time. So we translated so many books into Tibetan. Then at the end of 9th century, from 9th century to 13th century, for about 400 years, Tibet disintegrated. I won't go into details about how all this happens because you can read the books, right? So Tibet disintegrated for 400 years, but what happened during this period was that there was a lot of Buddhist revivalism. So many Tibetan masters went to India to study, particularly if you read about the autobiography of Marpa. He had traveled in his lifetime 3 times to India, 4 times to Nepal, climbing over so many mountains and valleys, down valleys, And Marpa started this Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. So around the same time, the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism also came into being. So the former religion that was there from 8th century onwards became the Nyingma tradition, right? So the Gaelic tradition came much later. So this was also an age of, even though we were not politically strong, but this was age of Buddhist revivalism inside Tibet and rejuvenism. Then politically, around 1220, by that time the Mongols had become very powerful, led by Genghis Khan. Right? Around 1220, it was the other Khan, Timur Lane, who came up to Tibet. Now the Mongols are known for their ruthlessness. If they want to invade Chicago, first they go to Wisconsin and they kill everybody there. So Chicago people naturally surrender without fighting in many cases. And that is what happened with the Mongol Empire. And they invaded a large swath of Asia and Europe. So even today the question is, who is the real Chinese? There are so many academic discussions inside China as to who is the real Chinese. Are the Han the real Chinese? Or the Chinese include the Manchus or the Mongols, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and all that. If Mongols are also Chinese, then China today can claim half of the world which Genghis Khan invaded as part of their legitimacy. So these are questions that will keep coming up in China as well. So Tibetans surrendered in 1220, so not many Tibetans were killed at that time. Another 25 years after that, then Altan Khan, the father of Kublai Khan, at that time when Altan Khan was there, because Mongols have a lot of tribes, and they are all related tribes, right? So the succeeding Khans also need not necessarily be from the same parentage, but whoever is more powerful at that time of the clans, of tribes. Before Kublai Khan took over the Khanship of the Mongols, his father, Altan Khan, had already developed relations with the Tibetans, and Altan wanted to learn Tibetan Buddhism. So they started looking for masters, and they chose Sakyapendita Kungwa Gyaltseng, a very well-known, renowned Buddhist monk. So Sakyapendita Kungwa Gyaltseng left to the Qinghai area where Altan Khan was living. And before Sakyapendita Kungwa Gyaltseng could reach there, his nephew, who was very young at that time, left before him to reach the Khan's place. And this young boy was so intelligent, and the Khan was so impressed that if this boy is so intelligent, then how would the master be? So later, of course, Sakyapendita Kungwa Gyaltseng became the imperial preceptor. And after the death of Sakyapendita Kungwa Gyaltseng, his nephew, Drongyun Shugi Pakwa, became the imperial preceptor, and then the Chinese Mongol Kublai Khan bestowed Drongyun Shugi Pakwa to rule over the 3 provinces of Tibet. And that is when we started the Sakya dynasty in Tibet. Right? And Sakya dynasty ruled for about 100 years. Now the point I'm making here is the Mongols ruled Mongolia. They also had some influence on Tibet. We developed this special priest-patron relationship. And then Kublai Khan invaded China. When after Kublai Khan invaded China, he didn't rule China from Mongolia. He ruled China from China, the whole empire, including Mongolia. Right? So historically, we have relations with the Mongols earlier than the Chinese. Only when China became part of the Mongol Empire, then it became the Yuan dynasty in China. Y-U-A-N, Yuan dynasty. So Yuans are actually not Chinese, they are Mongols. But it was given a Chinese name to effect legitimacy of that empire at that time. So that came to an end by 1368, the Yuan. So when Chinese say Yuan, it's only that period when the Mongols ruled. But the Mongols were there even before the Yuan and even after the Yuan. So those specifics we need to know about history to counter-argue with the Chinese. Right? Then after the Yuan dynasty from 1368, the Yuan was dethroned by the Ming dynasty. So the Mings are real Chinese. So from 1368 to 1644, the Chinese ruled China. But we had, within those 300 years, we had 3 other dynasties succeeding the Sakya dynasty. We had the Pamutrupa dynasty. We had the Rinpoomba dynasty, or some call it hegemony. Then we also have the Devatsangpa hegemony, which ruled Tibet for almost 100 years, for 300 years, right, up to 1642. The 5th Dalai Lama took over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet in 1642. Now, the Ming Empire in China was dethroned by the Manchus in 1644, 2 years after the 5th Dalai Lama had taken over the political leadership of Tibet. So you can see all these differences when you argue back to China, how you have to use your logic and reason in explaining your history back to the Chinese. And that is very important. So from 1644 to 1911, China was ruled by the Qing dynasty, which are the Manchus. Again, the Ming, the Chinese were dethroned by the Manchus. So that is, so during the Manchu period, again, we had war with Nepal. So we were having problem with Nepal, and then we sought help of the Manchu Empire. They sent their army, and they went back in 1720. Again, we had another problem with Nepal in the late 18th century, and the Chinese army came, but they didn't fight. They didn't fight for us, but they introduced a rule and things like that. So now they claim that China became part of Tibet became part of China in 18th century. But they were there for only a brief period. China never, neither the Mongols, nor the Chinese, nor the Manchus ever ruled Tibet directly. Today. 7th to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. 9th to 13th century, for about 400 years, Tibet disintegrated, but there was a revival of Buddhism. Then from the 13th century to 17th century, we had 4 hegemonies. China had one dynasty, the Ming dynasty, but we didn't have much relationship except for exchange of honorary titles. The Chinese emperors were also seeking Tibetan Buddhists as their masters. There were relations at different levels, but politically there was not much relation. Then from 17th century to 20th century, 1911, China was ruled by Qing, and Tibet was ruled by the Dalai Lamas. Okay, so these are comparisons. So by the 13th Dalai Lama took over the temporal leadership in 1895 at the end of 19th century. 8 years after that, British India, by that time, India had already come under the influence of the Britishers. So we call them the British India. So British India tried to invade Tibet. They were also, this is British India led by Colonel Young Husband. It's called the Expedition of the Colonel Young Husband. They came up to Tibet in Lhasa. They conquered Tibet, and His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Mongolia and eventually to China up to 1908 December. His Holiness was there, the 13th Dalai Lama was there in Beijing. Then after His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama came back from China to Lhasa, by the end of 1909, Chinese have already started coming from Kham to invade Tibet again. So that was led by General Tower Fang, and they killed so many people in Kham, and they came up to Lhasa, and His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama had to again flee to India. From 1910 to 1912, for 2 years, His Holiness was in Darjeeling, met with Lord Curzon in Calcutta. So if you're not familiar with all these names, it won't make any sense to you. But if I mention it once now, maybe you will think, okay, I've heard that name before. Then His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama returned back to Tibet in 1912. Then an agreement was signed between Mongolia and Tibet, declaring themselves to be independent of China. And that was followed by the Shimla Agreement of 1914, which demarcated the boundary between Tibet and India, which is called the McMahon Line. So this is still being followed as the line of control, line of actual control between China and Tibet. Now it's India and China, as according to the present situation. So those agreements were signed between British India and the independent government of Tibet. It was not ratified by the Chinese government. Initially they took part in the discussions, but in the final signing of the document, the ratification, they didn't come. So only during that period, Tibet was, Chinese like to divide like that. You have Inner Mongolia, Outer Mongolia. Chinese designated that. The Inner Mongolians don't like to be called themselves as Inner Mongolians. They like to be called as Southern Mongolians. Right? And that name till 1949 we have remained independent. Now many people say, oh, Tibet was independent from 1912 to 1949. That is not really the case. We have been independent since time immemorial, as Chinese says. Now, Chinese says that His Holiness the Dalai Lama should say that Tibet is part of China since time immemorial. Now, when is time immemorial? Historically, just to give you a very brief overview, is this. Now, maybe I'll touch a little bit on US-Tibet relations. I think when I wanted to do a small research on how Tibetans came to be in North America. So I was doing this, then I also decided to look for people who had visited Tibet from North America. First North Americans to go to Tibet. So I found it was William Woodville Rockhill, one person who was born in Philadelphia in around 1854, and to avoid the Civil War in the United States, his mother took him to Europe, and he lived in Paris, in France, and he studied at St. Clair's Military Academy, and he started learning Tibetan in his teens, in 1860-something. Now, even Tibetans are not willing to learn Tibetan. That's the problem. Those days, William Woodville Rockhill learned Tibetan in 1860s, and then he, I don't know for whatever reason, he was very, very influenced by Tibet. He wanted to know more about Tibet. And I think his thinking was influenced by these two French writers called Abbe Huc and M. Gabet, who visited Tibet in 1852-54. Those were recent publications when he was there in France, and some other publications that came before that. So after he finished his schooling, then he came back to the United States, got married, started a ranch, and then he thought that this is not my life. And he went back to Europe. When he was in the United States, again he studied Chinese and Sanskrit. For what? To understand more about Tibet. Then he went to China, because it was not possible for foreigners to enter Tibet from Western Tibet, from Teungari region, or from Southern Tibet. So people are trying from Kanting area, Tazeto area, people were trying from Amdo area, from the north. Even Russians were trying to come into Tibet from the north. There are many expeditions led by Russian generals coming into Tibet, but nobody could reach Lhasa. Even William Woodville Rockhill, he went to China in 1854. He worked in the Chinese embassy. Those days it used to be known as Chinese legation, not embassy. He worked there for 5 years. And when he was there, again he met with a Tibetan Lama called Tongho Rinpoche. And since he already knows Tibetan, but he is not used to the Lhasa dialect, because he doesn't have anybody to speak to in France or in the United States when he was studying Tibetan. So he learned the Lhasa dialect with Tongho Rinpoche in Beijing before he left to Tibet. So after 5 years working in the legation, then he went to Kumbum, and then he wanted to go to Lhasa. He crossed over the Dangla Pass, which is another high mountain range, and then landed in Nakchu, the present-day Nakchu. Now that was the boundary of the Tibet, the Kandem Khorang government ruled by the Dalai Lamas. And he was not allowed to enter Lhasa, into Tibet, into the region administered by the Dalai Lamas, and then he was sent from Kham, through Kham, from Nangshen, Derge, this area, into Tarzeto, and then he went back to United States. And he was here for 2 years, and again, and he wrote one book called The Lamas of Tibet, based on his visit there. You should read those books. It's interesting, because he's all very, very, he's very unusual, because he's not a Christian missionary. Right? He carried an anemometer to measure the height of mountains. He read so many travelers' books which have mentioned about altitude of mountains, height of mountains, and he verified those heights through the instruments that he carried. When he writes about the plants, the crops, what people eat, how the taxation and everything. So those, I consider those materials as valuable because it's unbiased. When Tibetans write Tibetan history, always there could be some bias. So William Woodville he came back 1891 again. He went back to Tibet. That time he was funded by the Smithsonian Institution and the National Museum, so he's better equipped. Again, he could not reach Lhasa, but he collected a lot of material from other regions of Tibet and then came back to the United States, and there was a huge collection of Woodwell's treasure trove that he brought from Tibet. Then he worked in the State Department for several years, and he was the first person to contribute a full volume of Dege Kanjur in 1899 to the Library of Congress here in the United States. And today, the Library of Congress in the United States has the largest collection of Tibetan books, about 16,000 in all in Tibetan, and they have it there. And if you want to have, if in future, if you want to do any research on Tibet, Library of Congress has all the materials. But unfortunately, they are not able to digitize it so far. Teacher. William, I talked about the Young Husband expedition in 1904. Then July 1904, the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Mongolia. And when he was in Mongolia, a Russian scientist told the 13th Dalai Lama that there is an American ambassador in China who can speak Tibetan. That was the first contact between an American official and a Dalai Lama. And that person happened to be William Woodville Rockhill again. By that time, he had become the ambassador of the United States government to China. And then when His Holiness was in Wutai Shan, the ambassador walked for 5 days to meet with the 13th Dalai Lama. And he was witness to the meeting between the Imperial China and the Dalai Lama, 13th Dalai Lama. And he had written a historical called The Relations Between the Manchus and the Dalai Lamas in 1909. Diteb Dimingla, Relations Between Manchus and the Dalai Lamas by William Woodville Rockhill. And I think he must have been the first person to write an historical on Tibet in 1909. Then he died in 1912 after he was transferred to Russia, where he was not interested. But he was all his life, all his interest was Tibet. And unfortunately, not many people know about him. His interest goes beyond that. He looked at so many materials, and he translated books of people who visited that region in 13th, 14th centuries in different languages. He translated into English. So those materials are also available. Then, the President Frederick Roosevelt the 1908-9 was Shigerta. There are two Frederick Chiguri, American president now. And it's one of those things. And there were National Geographic explorations into Tibet. There were another American called Sikyong Cutting, who visited Tibet in 1936. He wanted to go before that. Since 1926, he has been working towards getting into Tibet, but they can't go beyond Yangtze, because that was the agreement we had with British India as a trade mart. And beyond Yangtze, if you want to go, there has to be a special permit from Lhasa, and he couldn't get that. And during the lifetime of the 13th Dalai Lama, he could not go. And he started sending presents, big dogs to the 13th Dalai Lama, heating materials to the 13th Dalai Lama. And the 13th Dalai Lama gave him 2 apsos. So when Sikyong Cutting died, actually he is more known as an adventurist to save the giant tortoise of the Galapagos. But in his obituary, it was more about Sikyong Cutting bringing Lhasa Apso to America. So all the Lhasa Apso ancestry goes back to Sikyong Cutting's Lhasa Apso that he brought from Tibet. Lhasa Apso Kidwa, Shingirwa, that small doggy. So there were several things. Then by the Second World War, around 1942-43, the Allied group were not able to send materials from India to China. So they were looking for a route to send materials, and then they tried to negotiate with the Tibetan government. So they sent two people from here. One is Ilya Tolstoy. Ilya Tolstoy is the grandson of Tolstoy. A famous literary figure in Russia. Leo Tolstoy's grandson. Ilya Tolstoy was working in the State Department at that time, and he was accompanied by another mountaineer called Brooke Dillon, and they came up to Tibet and they stayed there for a few months. And now what the Western world could see during their stay, that was also the period of Tibetan New Year. So they had filmed the celebration of Tibetan New Year in 1942-43, and these are still available as part of the presentation by the father and son duo who represented the ABC television. They went into Tibet. ABC television went into Tibet in 1949-50. Around that same period, if you go to State Department now, I always make it a point when you go to Foggy Bottom at the State Department, when you enter, on the left there is a list of honored people who died on duty, diplomatic officials who died on duty. So in that you will see a general's name, General McKiernan Douglas. He was killed by the Tibetans on the border because the message sent by United States government to Lhasa to receive him received too late, and the Tibetans killed him before he could be received. But his assistant was alive. So two of them, because he was posted in Beijing, and at that time they were afraid that China would develop uranium, nuclear energy, and they wanted to make sure that China doesn't get hold of all this. And Xinjiang, present-day East Turkestan, is known for uranium deposits, and they went to look for those, and then they came through the Changdang area into Tibet, and he died. So even now in the State Department Honorary Board, you will see this name, Douglas McKiernan, killed in Tibet. That's why I point out to the State Department officials, it's not China, it was Tibet, in your own records. You know. 그래서 충주충주 내가 열봐. 그래서 예자야라. 도시에 저행에 들려고 I deliberately show it to all the staff there. Then by 1950, Chinese communists have already, 1949, communism has already taken over China, and they established the Republic of China. By 1950, they were already coming into Tibet. Eastern part, Kham Amdo, there was already problem. Then 1950, October, His Holiness, China invaded Chamdo. Then the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Tomo, again on the border with India. If it comes to such a dire situation that he has to cross over to India, then there was a choice. Around 1950, His Holiness stayed in Tomo for about 7 months till July 1951, and the 17-point agreement was signed in May 1951. So to do this, you can remember the time that the 17-point agreement was signed, and then we tried to live under that agreement for 8 years before His Holiness Dalai Lama fled to India in 1959. By around 1950, when His Holiness was in Tromo, some historicals indicate that the US ambassador in Delhi at that time, Ambassador Loy Henderson, is supposed to have written to His Holiness the Dalai Lama through an intermediary at that time. But His Holiness decided to return back to Lhasa instead of coming into exile, and then we had to live under those agreements. By 1954-55, His Holiness went to China, and he saw how communist government functioned. Even though everything looked very orderly, people had no freedom to speak their mind. Then 1956-57, His Holiness was in India, and he saw the Indian Parliament, and even though it was very chaotic, he found that people had the freedom to speak. And as soon as we came into exile, we adopted democracy, right? So 1956, when His Holiness was in India, Tsering was already in the United States since 1951, and he already had relations with the Foggy Bottom in the State Department. And Tsering, it seems, by 1956 handed over his relationship with CIA to Galutunrup, the other elder brother, the second elder brother of His Holiness. And then the CIA-Tibet relations started. Then we sent 6 people, Lidan Athar, Lodze, Gyadusang, Gyadokesang, and 3 others, right? 6 people, not on U.S. soil, but a soil occupied by United States called Saipan, in the Mariana Archipelago north of Guam today. So they were trained there, and then they were sent back to Tibet. In 57, we had sent another team, and then that team was sent to Washington, D.C. area, in Maryland area, the place called Camp Peary, where they were trained, and later they were moved to Colorado. So many of you must have heard Chuchikandu training that Colorado. So that was later, right, from 57 onwards. And then we had this guerrilla warfare, and all this association started and then ended till went on up to 1968. Then Kissinger and Nixon were credited with opening up China to the world. Then US-China relationship increased. And then we were even asked to close down our Office of Tibet in New York, which was initially started by CIA in 1963-64, including our office in Geneva and Tibet House in Delhi. All these were started by CIA. Then our relationship stopped. Then again, His Holiness could come to United States for the first time only in 1979 during Jimmy Carter's time. The person who was responsible to order, to grant visa to His Holiness is still there in Washington, D.C. I met him in June again. So those relationships, and then His Holiness came over and over again to the United States. The relationship built. His Holiness found that U.S. Congress is very powerful. Then he made his first 5-point peace proposal in the Congress to the Human Rights Caucus. And that was the beginning of a new chapter of our relationship with the U.S. government. And following that, His Holiness had the Strasbourg proposal in Europe, and then His Holiness received the Nobel Peace Prize. His Holiness became very well known to the world. And then there was this program to immigrate 1,000 Tibetans here. Many of you are children of those people who immigrated here. So it started in 1990. There is, if you want to thank anybody, there's another person called Ed Burnett who lives in Connecticut now. He was responsible for pushing this legislation because he knows some members in the Congress, and they pushed this as part of a larger bill to move 30,000 Polish people into the United States. So we surreptitiously put 1,000 Tibetans in that bill. Tenzin Namgyala was there in the initial stage. Rinjin Thalola was also there. And Tenzin Taglala was handling all this. Khonso Tanda Thangbo Yongechur was the first batch. He was responsible for designating who should go to which area, in which state in the United States. Then 1993, by that time they had already started supporting Voice of America Tibetan Service. By 1993, then they started supporting Radio Free Asia. By 1997, the first special representative for Tibet was appointed, Greg Craig. I met him last time also, he's still alive. And then to 2000, Clinton's time, China's entry into WTO, and the free trade between the United States and China. Because of that, a precondition was to monitor human rights situation inside China, including Tibet. And even now, because of that, they formed this commission called the Congressional Executive Commission on China, CECC, which is one of the important commissions for us, because it's bicameral, and this is a bicameral commission. You have representation of both Senate and the House. Since then, and we started working on the Tibet Policy Act from 2000 onwards, and this Tibet Policy Act was adopted in 2002. It takes time to move a bill, to work on it and get it approved. So, to 2002 Tibet Policy Act provides for negotiation report. So, US is supposed to help us in negotiation, and they have to report to the Congress every year on negotiation. This also provides for US to start a consulate in Lhasa. Even now, our friends in the Congress are pressurizing the State Department that if Chinese government wants to open another consulate in US, then they should press for a consulate in Lhasa. And you remember a few years back when the US government closed down the Houston Chinese embassy consulate. In retaliation, the Chinese government closed down the Chengdu US consulate, and that is the nearest consulate to Tibet. So once that is removed, we have difficulty accessing to Western nations, and for the Western nations to also to understand the situation inside Tibet. Then 2006 or 7, His Holiness was conferred with the US Congressional Gold Medal. And 2018-19, then we moved this. By the time when I came as the representative here, the International Campaign for Tibet and all others were working on this reciprocal access to Tibet bill. Now it has already become an act, so you have this RATA Act, which means if a Chinese citizen has visa to come to US, that person can visit all parts of US. Whereas a US citizen, if they have a visa to go to China, they can visit China, but they cannot go to Tibet. You have to have another special permit to go into Tibet. So that is where there is no reciprocity, because diplomacy is all about reciprocity, right? Now then there was again revision to the Tibet support, the Tibet Policy Act in the form of Tibet Support and Policy Act of 2020. So that is where we are. Today, we receive about $8 million support for Tibetans in exile, plus another 3 million, and plus 2.5 million for population, refugees, and migrations on health, sanitation, and all that. 3 million for capacity building for Central Tibetan administration, 6 million for health, education, and rehabilitation of Tibetans, and another 10 million for Tibetans inside Tibet. So, US government is perhaps the only country that gives us the most political support as of today. Okay, I'll stop here. Today, I'm not in the right frame of mind, so my words are not flowing as it used to. Okay, then we will have interactive session. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really rich history of Tibet. Starting with one minor question. You were mentioning, I think it was in the 4th century, that the king of Tibet, there was the Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism, and the king had them debate. And the Indian Buddhists won. What was it that they debated?
On the concept of nirvana. You talk about enlightenment, then how do you, because I'm not an expert on Buddhism. Chinese Buddhists believe that if you just sit and meditate, you will gain enlightenment. But the Buddhist masters, the Indian Buddhist masters, because we follow the Tantrayana, Mahayana, there are 2 vehicles, the Theravada and the Mahavada. This will be a totally different subject on Buddhism, and basically it's the Sanskrit tradition of Buddhism and the Pali tradition of Buddhism. During Buddha's time, Pali used to be the local language, and Sanskrit used to be the language of the elite or the intellectuals. So when Buddha first initially taught, he taught very simple things, the 4 Noble Truths and things like that. And eventually, then he spoke about the higher teachings, which only we practice now. So people who practice Buddhism in Thailand, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, all these places, they follow the Pali tradition. So they follow only the basic teachings of the Buddha at the initial stage. Now other countries like Tibet, China, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, we follow the Mahayana tradition, the greater wheel, so which includes Tantrayana and all that, not just the basic teachings, but beyond all that. So, but the Chinese are also that. But Chinese practice at that time, the master was talking about just sitting in solitude and meditating, and then you will gain enlightenment. Whereas in the Mahayana tradition, as you gain enlightenment, you also have to work towards helping others in gaining enlightenment. Maybe in this context, I am not an expert, but the emperor at that time decided that the Indian system is better because India is the origin of Buddhism. And even now we follow that. So His Holiness always says that Tibetan emperors were very smart at that time. So instead of adopting language from China, even though the Tibetan emperor had a Chinese princess, Songtsen Gampo had a Chinese princess, but the Tibetan language came from India. And Tibetan Buddhism also came from India. So this we are talking about, the debate we are talking about 8th century. Tibetan language we are talking about 7th century. Okay? The language came first 1 century before Buddhism.
My name is Tsering. I have a question for you. As Sikyong of Tibet, what do you think are some important qualities that someone should have as Prime Minister?
First, what I always say is that you need to be truthful. One basic quality, you have to be truthful. So even during my campaign, whatever I believe that I can do, only those issues I covered. I never made any false promises. If I think that this is something that I will not be able to do, then I don't talk about it. But we can, when you are in position, you can try, right, and develop. But to be truthful is always a plus point. I always tell my ministers also, all the executive members also, all the members of the administration also, that if you are not being truthful, someday you will have a problem. Right? So to cover up one lie, then you will have to tell another lie, then you will have to tell another lie, then it will be lies upon lies upon lies. Then you will, one day they will find out. Then you will have to say sorry. So instead of that, if you make it, of course we are all human and we err, right? We make mistakes and learn and then improve. So when we do a lot of work, we make mistakes also. While we speak also, we make mistakes. If you realize the mistake, then you recognize it and then say sorry from the very beginning. It's easier. You say sorry once, it's enough. Then you lie many times, then you have to say sorry many times. And then people will start losing trust in you. That is the most important part. Then of course you have to know your situation. Now as Sikyong, I have to understand how the Chinese government works, how Chinese government thinks. Then I have to also understand history. That is why I read so many books to understand history, right? To be able to tell you, to be able to counter back to China in whatever sense. So you have to be knowledgeable about things inside Tibet, inside China, internationally. Then you know exactly where you need to go. Then you will get a direction. Then you will have a vision. Right, so in another 2-3 months, we will come out with a full vision paper of about 32 pages, A4 size. When it's printed, I don't know how long, how many pages it will be. But you need a vision to be a leader, to tell people that, okay, this is where we are going. Otherwise, we are all groping in the dark. Nobody knows who is doing what, right? So you need a vision. And then you need that commitment to work hard. So if you get a position, and if you just sit there, it's not going to work on its own. You have to be there to guide, to take the lead in everything, right? So one advantage with me was my 20 years of service in the parliament, and even as speaker for 7.5 years, I know the administration, even though I was not part of the executive. We were part of the legislative, right? Once you know all this, then you can have a holistic understanding of the situation. Once you have a holistic understanding, then you can also find holistic solutions. So your mind also always has to be geared towards resolving problems. So every time somebody comes to me, I know it's a problem, right? Most of the time, it's a problem. So when that person starts speaking, I have to start thinking about solution. So two things I always tell people. First, you have to understand the rules. In democracy, you have to understand the rules, right? First, if somebody comes with a question, you have to see whether it is in accordance with the rules or not. If it is not in accordance with the rules, you reject it immediately. That's it, because it doesn't go according to rules, right? If it concerns some money, first you have to check the budgetary provisions. It is there or not. So these two things I always ask them to check if somebody comes with a problem. If these two are okay, then you apply your mind in how to resolve this. You know the rules, you know the rules of governance, you also know the budgetary process and everything, you know, understand the situation, then you can find solutions. Because your job is to find solutions, to handle problems, to handle challenges. So all this capacity you need, and you need to be fair. So during my campaign also, the three campaign slogans that we used, one was equitable. So whatever we do, we want to be fair and we want to be equitable in distribution of our scarce resources. Right? So when we look at programs, we don't see who is a Khamba or a Amdo or a Uzang. We don't differentiate between the beneficiaries as to which province they come from or which religious tradition they come from. So as long as it's a need-based approach, people express their problems, we have to look into their problems and try to resolve it. Is it okay? Enough? I don't know. You need so many qualities, but still.
That was a great answer,
Yeah. Please.
This summer you spoke to the Sarah College summer program students and the CTA, and I was there. That was very insightful. I was just wondering if you had to give like one message for Tibetan youth, like worldwide, what would that be?
I will give you a classic example with little explanation. When I started working for the Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center as director in Delhi, in 2003 or 4, we invited Professor Samdong Rinpoche to speak to younger generations of Tibetans about their responsibilities. Then Rinpoche spoke for 1 hour, but he didn't speak about any of the responsibilities. Then what did he speak for 1 hour? He explained these two Tibetan words, the two words. One, the Tibetan word lenge, which is translated as responsibility in English, right? Now, from the framing of the word itself, the framer's mentality is reflected there. So when we say lenge, it is something that comes out of your own goodwill to do that job. You are not asked to do that, right? From that word itself. Now, if you look at the English word, responsibility, it originates from response. Response means somebody asks you to do something and you respond to that. These are the two differences in these two wordings itself that reflects the psychology of the people who framed this. So Rinpoche explained about these two words for about 1 hour, and at the end he said, I am a Tibetan, you all are also Tibetan, so I'm nobody to tell you what to do. Just like there was nobody to tell me what I should do. So if you feel that you are a Tibetan, that you have an added responsibility, then you have to take up the responsibility. Nobody should be telling you what you need to do. That is my message in continuation of what Professor Rinpoche said, that I don't need to, or we don't need to tell you what your responsibility is. Of course, it's our job to inform you about what has happened, what is happening, and now it's up to you, whether you take up the responsibility. I cannot be in Chicago and keep pushing you, no? So it's up to wherever you are. You know, as His Holiness also says, this life, you are a Tibetan, whether you like it or not. You cannot change, maybe some people change blood, but you can't change all your blood and skin and your bone. And if you change everything, you are no more what you are, right? Even if it's scientifically possible. So at least this life, you are a Tibetan, whether you are a US citizen or a Canadian citizen or citizen in any parts of Europe or whatever. So as a Tibetan, you have an added responsibility. When you go around, of course, American, you meet with other Americans, but they don't have an added responsibility. Their responsibility is only looking after their own well-being and happiness. And in the process of chasing happiness, they chase unhappiness, unfortunately. So for me also, our salary is very little. My monthly salary is 40,000 rupees, which is $500. 8 fives are 40. $500. So my salary is $500 in 1 month. But I'm not there for salary. You know, when I die, I want to be happy with myself that I did something good to serve others. And while serving others, I serve myself also, because I'm part of the others also. Right? If I look for only for salary, then I should be somewhere here. My wife is in Toronto, my daughter is in Toronto, so I should be working in Toronto rather than Dharamsala. So this gives us, because it's not only money that gives you happiness. Essentially, is the job satisfaction that you get from what you do, right? And you need to do what you want to do. Then you become happy in doing that. You may get a lot of money, but if you don't get the happiness, what do you do? Maybe you can go for vacation, costly vacation, and come back. But again, same thing. You face the same problems. But money alone does not bring happiness. So all those things need to be considered. And then if we realize that we have an added responsibility, then one should work towards it and then be happy.
You kind of answered my first question right now, so I'll change it a bit. My question was, although we may not face the same agrarian challenges that our forefathers had faced, I found that we face an even greater issue that many of our youth struggle with deciding what to do with the rest of their lives and how they can contribute to the idea that you mentioned that there's something larger than themselves. Although this issue may be a universal one, I believe that we Tibetans are in a completely different circumstance than the society around us. With our home being taken away and our government being forced into exile, I personally have always searched for the opportunity to enable progress within my personal life and as well and within my community as well. So instead of asking you what you believe that we should do in order to contribute to both our own personal lives and our community, I instead will ask you, what do you think that we should do to help encourage our youth to follow in the footsteps of not only yourself, but many like you, many like the people that you mentioned, the professors, the diplomats and whatnot, who find it so eager and important to help our Tibetan cause?
First, you have to develop the interest in any subject or any work that you want to do, right? So to develop that interest, then you have to read more and more, understand more and more. So once you do that, how do you develop all this? Do you often meet to discuss about political situations inside Tibet? Normally, you don't. So maybe you can meet once a month, let's say, starting with once a month, take up one topic. Before you meet, look at subjects or the videos or contents that you want to look, and then come here and meet and debate. And let there be an elderly person also to correct you if you are making a mistake. And that person also should be knowing things, you know. Then form a group. See, the problem we face is in the late 80s, there was a lot of trouble inside Tibet, and then we have many Tibet supporters in the 90s. In the 90s, there were, mid-90s, there were Beastie Boys, there were students, all the earning from the Beastie Boys went to establishing of students for Free Tibet, and there were more than 500 chapters in the whole of the United States at one time. That was the kind of euphoria that was created on Tibet by the leadership of His Holiness. Now it is all down. We used to have so many Friends of Tibet. In LA alone, we have Santa Barbara Friends of Tibet, Orange County Friends of Tibet, this, that. Now it's no more there. Now you have only one Friends of Tibet in San Francisco, and that too is led by a person who is married to a Tibetan lady. You know, so the ICT is the only organization that exists today. So can we have, if you understand the situation about Tibet, then you will be able to convince others to support you, right? Now there are more Tibetans in the West, but less supporters. So can each one of you bring five friends for Tibet conference? Is it possible or not? Right. Yes. So you meet once a month, develop a strategy as to how we need to increase our outreach. Right? Not only within the Tibetan community, but outside the Tibetan community, because then you are talking with future leaders. One reason why I'm speaking with the youngsters, because you are the future, and you have the intelligence, you have the know-how, you have everything. Only thing you need is you need to know a little more about Tibet and be engaged. Right? Elderly people, I speak to them, but I don't expect them to change too much. But they have done their job, right? And they will continue to do it. But the younger generation is something that we really need to focus. And if we can, from this meeting, if we can start by having a monthly meeting of all of you and try to develop a strategy as to how we can be more involved. You don't need to follow one person or another person. As long as you understand what you need to do, read, listen, because I listen to a lot of His Holiness teachings. Right? That helps me a lot in conducting myself. So sometimes I jokingly say that Parliament session is my retreat session. People pay money to go on retreats for meditation, this, that. Meditation is nothing but concentration of mind. So in the Parliament, when people ask questions, then I have to concentrate and note down the questions and prepare my answers. That is meditation. And some people speak out of turn, some people speak loudly, some illogically. You practice compassion. Then we know some people are motivated badly. You practice tolerance. You don't have to speak in the same way that other person is speaking at you. If you do that, then there is no progress. Then it's like cat fight in the Parliament also. So now when you watch the Parliament, when some are saying crazy things, we respond in a in a nice way. So people realize who's saying what, who is responding, because our responsibility as executive is to be accountable, to be answerable, and to be responsible to the public and to the Parliament. That we will continue to do. And as long as you're doing your job well, you don't have to fear anybody. If you have done something wrong, then there's always in the mind, oh, I've done something wrong, so maybe that person will get to know about it and then pin me down. If you don't have that, you have nothing to fear about anything. And as long as you know exactly what you're doing, then you don't have to worry about answering, because you know what to say all the time on any given topic. No problem.
Hello, my name is Sensen Puka, and then my question is just like you said, you could have just taken a job in Toronto with your family, pursued a career, and you know how people growing up with the internet, social media, they tend to have the most lacking of purpose with their lives. So how did you go about finding your own purpose, and what's your advice to the youth of finding their own purpose outside career, social media, materialistic things?
No, we are all different generations. He had a different experience in his life. I was born in 66, 67. So this was just 6 years after coming into exile. So everybody was living in very difficult conditions. So all our pants were patched up, I don't know how many, 6, 7 times, So very poor condition, but our parents always explain about the situation inside Tibet. So we have never seen, even now I've never been to Tibet. It's all imaginary, right? Now you have at least Google Map to look at. But I was always very interested in geography. So I always try to understand rivers, mountains, this place, that place. So I can place myself mentally as to which place is what. Since I've never seen Tibet, I can still talk about places in Tibet. Once you understand the gravity of that, from childhood, you are attuned to taking up that, getting to hear all this, and then you feel that, you have an added responsibility. And then, of course, the leadership of His Holiness. Then my father's advice. These two combined together, I was always committed that this life, I'm a Tibetan, and I'll keep working for my people. At whatever level, I may be Sikyong, I may be Chitu, I may be whatever. So when I was in the school also, I was a school captain for 3 years. When I was in college, these demonstrations were going inside Tibet, 87, 88, 89, where the Guchusum started. No? The Guchusum, former political prisoners association started in Dharamsala after those events. So those things were happening parallelly, and we were also very engaged in organizing protest demonstrations in Chennai, where we were studying. And we were very few Tibetans there, because there are no Tibetan settlements in Tamil Nadu, the whole state. So only people we could get were sweater sellers in different cities. So we asked them to come join us in Chennai, and then we organized. We got along with politicians, with the DGP or police, and police used to send us buses to travel into with Tibetan flags inside. So all those relations we started building, even as a kid, even as a child, from school to college. And then immediately after that, because mine was a big family, I was third out of 9 children, and very poor family. And I never took a single penny for my education from my family. I worked from 7 to 11 at night in a restaurant. So today I'm a good cook also. So my major was economics, but that didn't give me a job immediately after I left college. So we started a restaurant in Pondicherry. So that's how we built 2-3 years. Then I got elected because of my interest. Then I got elected as a General Secretary of the Central Executive Committee of Dome. Then 2 years after that, I got elected to the Parliament. So once you are elected to the Parliament, there is already a platform. So as long as you perform well, you take part in committee work, you speak about budget, your own strength, because you can't, at that level, you can't be good in everything, right? At that time, let me be frank, I don't know much about the situation inside Tibet when I first joined the Parliament. Started learning. So every single day, even now as I speak to you, I'm learning, right? So learning is never-ending process. So every single day, every little thing, we keep learning, and that adds up. And that builds you for what you are. And then once you feel confident that you can take up this job, you can do this job really well, that is when I decided to stand for Sikyong, because I thought I'm in a good position to shape our movement's future. So during the last election, I didn't go out of my house because pandemic was going on. I took some principal positions that when the pandemic was going on, I will not go and meet the public. Even if I may get few more votes, if people die because of this, I don't want to be responsible for that. Right? So I spoke virtually. Every Saturday I spoke on different topics. I never asked anybody to vote for me. I always said, if you give me the responsibility, then I will do this on different subjects every single day. So that is how we shaped ourselves. That's how we decided to take our involvement. For me, it's not an issue of power. For me, it's an issue of responsibility. So responsibility, once you feel you're confident that you can do this job, then there's no stopping you. Yeah, but even now, even despite all my will and vision and all that, there are always challenges because it's a democratic system, so you have to work with the parliament, you have to work with the Public Service Commission, all these structures, and then see how best to get around it and get your things done.
I know that you're currently traveling around, but in India and the CTA, what does a typical work day look like for Sikyong?
In India,
Yeah.
typical
Yeah. Work day. For
work day.
Yeah.
Oh, that varies because normally it depends on how my day is structured. Because normally every single day from 9 to 5, 6, it's meetings, 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 meetings. And if you are invited for a program, I always tell people if it's not that important, please don't get me there, because if you go for a program, you have to travel half an hour, speak there, listen to others, then come back. Half of the day is gone. So for me, even half day is very important, you know. So every single day, during the day, we have meetings all through. Meetings of different, because I'm also responsible for 4 departments apart from being a Sikyong, right? Then evening when I come back home, there are at least 7, 8 articles on Tibet, China, internationally, everywhere. So I read all those articles which are dedicated on Tibet and China, because we have appointed one person to collect all those international news on Tibet, and then those are sent to us. I look through all those, spend half an hour, 45 minutes. Then I have to watch news. Even while here in the United States, every single evening I have to watch CNN, I have to watch MSNBC, which are on similar lines. Then the twist to that, I have to watch Fox. Right? Because you have to listen to every, just because you don't like something, that doesn't mean to say that you don't have to listen, right? You have to understand that perspective, how people give spin to issues. So those you have to all those things. So even in India also, now we have access to CNN, Al Jazeera, Beyond TV, all those. So I spent quite a number of hours watching television to watch news, what developments are there. And then till 11:30, 12 at night, I call people. Because daytime I cannot pick up the call. So I start calling back people. If somebody had left a message, I call back. If not, even then I call back. So from 9 to 12, then I sleep for 8 hours. I don't wake up very early. I wake up around 8 o'clock. So I sleep for 7, 8 hours. Because if you have to speak to Europe and America, it's always in the night there, right?
Sigula, I have a question. What do you think about Umelam, and do you think this will lead to freedom or something?
Now, Umelam is the only viable and the pragmatic approach, right? Because when His Holiness started thinking about Umelam in the early 70s, that was when cultural revolution was going on, and a lot of things are being destroyed inside Tibet. And then His Holiness must have thought that it's better to preserve our own identity before it is erased from the face of this earth. So that was the sense of urgency. Now our aim is to be able to preserve for the Tibetans inside Tibet, to be able to use their language, culture, religion, preserve, promote, all those. This is the main important. Even if we gain independence, if Tibetan identity is no more there in Tibet, then what will independence provide us? So if we speak about independence, China will not speak to us. If we speak about independence, no other nations will support us. Yes, they keep saying Tibet is part of PRC. We are trying to change that mindset now by speaking about history, the historical status of Tibet. So those things are there. Our strategy is to talk about independence, historical status of Tibet, but work towards resolution through a middle way approach. Because whether we like it or not, we have to live in Tibet in future, and whenever we get to go back to Tibet. And China, Tibet, we are all neighbors. We can't lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Pacific or the Atlantic, right? And Tibet is huge. 2.5 million square kilometers. It's 10 times the size of UK. Right. Then, if you think about development, do you think Tibetans alone will be able to do it, economic development? It's not like building road here in Chicago. You build road in Tibet, you have to build over mountains and valleys, you have to dig tunnels and build bridges, and how much costly it becomes. So can the Tibetans alone do it? These are all logical things that we need to think about. Right. That is why we are talking about mutually beneficial. So China has economically developed. We are landlocked. So either we have to depend on India or China for economic development. And since China is already developed or developing, we can gain economically from the Chinese. And we are talking about more than 250 million to 300 million Chinese Buddhists who are deprived of their spirituality. And they look at the Tibetans for some spiritual solace. And we can fill that void among the Chinese Buddhist community through our religious and spiritual practice. Right? This is achievable, possible, if there is. That is why in Oxford also, when I spoke there, I told them, you need to do a small surgery in the head of the Chinese leadership to put common sense there. So if common sense prevails in the mind of the Chinese leadership, the Sino-Tibet conflict is not a big issue to be resolved.
As many Tibetan youth raised in the West, whether it be Europe or the United States or Canada, are susceptible to cultural assimilation or face a sort of cultural disconnect. What has the CTA done or plan to do to address this, whether it be funding initiatives such as the Starter College Summer Immersion Program or creating its own cultural programs such as bringing volunteers from Dharamsala to here during the summer, anything like that?
We have summer camps for TCV, organized by TCV. We have summer immersion programs in Sara. But we can still, if you are willing, if you want to learn more, of course we can't be spending for everything, so we have to do some cost sharing for those expenses. But if you want to, then we can organize many more. It's not a problem in organizing. These are small things. For us to organize 1 week program, 1 month program, we can do it easily. This is not a problem. But there has to be interest from the youngsters. From Chicago, if you tell me that next year we'll send 20 children there, we'll make sure that you get what you want in all the institutions because we have access. Should not be a problem at all. And then here in the United States also we do try to do this leadership program in Garrison, but we are not able to accommodate everybody. Now that we have come out with this VTAG initiative, the Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group initiative, there will be a regional conference of youth in North America. There will be regional conference in Europe, in Australasia region, in India. So there will be at least 4 regional conferences and 1 international conference. So all youth will come together, which means not all youth, that means several thousand. So there will be representative of youth from all sections at an international level. So those interactions will definitely increase over the time to come. We have for 23-24 we have at least 5 meetings for youth, regional and international. So these will give you opportunity to interact more with other Tibetans and also share best practices. How you have been successful here, you can share with others. So only thing is we seek your involvement.
I have a question. Although the government may be in exile, a good son of our population remains in Tibet. How does the Tibetan government plan to improve human rights in Tibet?
Tibetan government, they're in exile. How can we improve? That is little difficult because, as I said earlier, there was a time when we had no access to Tibet at all in the 70s, 80s. Only from the 80s, Tibet opened up a little bit when Hu Yaobang was the premier of the Communist Party, and he sent his own team to study situation inside Tibet to find out the reality, because people, the lower level cadres, what they report to high authorities is something else. So he found that situation in Tibet has become worse than before 1959. So he sent back 85% of the Chinese cadres back to Tibet back to China in the 80s, and there was some improvement in the situation. And Penpa Rinpoche was also released after Mao Zedong's death in 1976, right? And Penpa Rinpoche also worked very hard to get Tibetan back online, Tibetan language, culture, and all those. So there was reintroduction of Tibetan language being used on billboards, these, Now, since 2008, I was mentioning yesterday also, before 2008 we used to receive from early 90s to particularly the early 2000s of the new millennium, we used to receive between 2,500 to 3,000 Tibetans every year, and mostly young children, not knowing whether they will ever meet their family again or not. At one time, I met 6, 8, 10, 6 years, 3 brothers. And this 10-year-old boy looked like a very mature person because he was responsible for bringing his 2 younger brothers along with him over the Himalayas. At that age, once you go through difficulties, then you know how to handle life. Right? Now, there's too much restriction inside Tibet, too much pressure on the Nepalese government. They have done away with all the tourist guide in Lhasa. Without tourist guide, you cannot come over the Himalayas by yourself, right? So many things have changed. So in 2020, we had only 5 people from Tibet. In 2021, only 10 people. 2022, only 4 people. Now 23 just began, right? So because of less number of people coming in, we have a lot of problems with information flow also. So we cannot send people inside. So it's very difficult to influence, but then of course there are interactions individually within families. But now these days people are saying don't say things. So these are marks, okay, it's very tight now. Don't make, even if you say something political, very small issue, you get caught, get jailed. So we have to try different ways of getting our messages inside, not just the radios. The radios are also being jammed. Right? It's difficult, but we can't say it's difficult and take it as it is. We have to work doubly hard to make sure that our messages also reach there. But the spirit of the Tibetans are very strong. It's only because of the spirit of Tibetans inside Tibet that we are surviving here. If they are demoralized, and because of what we do here in exile about how they see in the parliament and all that, they might get demoralized. If they get demoralized and don't do anything, then there's no more a Tibet cause, right?
Unfortunately, I know you have a little bit more time, but there are kids in this room that are waiting. So those are also the rising suns and moons of Tibet. So we would, we thank you for addressing this group of young students. But if you don't mind, kind of whispering through these 4 classrooms, and then if all of you, please come on to the stage. We're here, like, they have to go to the stage too, right? Yeah.
Limited Chiktung Nita 2.5
Yeah.
Also